The U.S. military is scheduled to leave Afghanistan in September. If it happens on schedule, our longest-running war will be over after 2 decades. A look at the historical record will prove that this war was a mistake the country was led to while in a state of shock after the biggest terror attack in its history. Let's go back in time. Just a week after 9/11, Congress had already authorized military force in Afghanistan. Less than a month later, the U.S. was at war, aiming to destroy the Taliban, a theocratic terror group that had controlled much of the country since the mid-1990s. And at the time, Americans were overwhelmingly in favor. In some polling soon after the war began, support for the conflict was higher than 90%. This isn't surprising. The so-called rally around the flag effect is well documented. Major disasters, including terror attacks, tend to unify people across the political spectrum, at least for a time, around the government in power. And so the Bush administration took full advantage of this political goodwill and pushed through the Patriot Act, a 300-page law which dramatically expanded the government's ability to spy on and seize information from U.S. citizens. State, local, and federal governments engaged in widespread profiling of Muslims. The ACLU notes that the NYPD's Muslim surveillance program considered indicators of radicalization to include growing a beard, wearing traditional Islamic clothing, or abstaining from alcohol. And while civil liberties were squeezed at home, war raged abroad. By early December of 2001, an interim government had been named, and a few days later, the Taliban collapsed. They no longer controlled the country, but were still there 2 decades later. Why? Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires for a reason. Ousting the Taliban from control of the country was only the very first step. The U.S. at that point was an occupying power, and they had to act like one if they ever wanted to leave. That meant building a stable Afghanistan, and those don't come easy. The nation is difficult to control for long, owing to both its geography and its history. Fighting in the mountains is difficult, and Afghanistan is covered in them. They're huge. In some areas, they can reach higher than 20,000 feet. And the Taliban took full advantage of the country's geography, hiding in remote cave complexes in the mountains. This wasn't a new strategy. In fact, fighters have done it since the Mongol invasion of Afghanistan in the 13th century. The Taliban also employed IEDs, which proved devastating to coalition forces. From 2011 to 2020, nearly 50% of military deaths were attributable to them. And so the war dragged on as the years went by and the cost went up, and by 2010, money spent on the conflict had reached nearly $100 billion a year. By 2011, we weren't drawing back but escalating. Obama, who was elected on a promise to end the war, increased troop levels from 30,000 to more than 100,000. The assurances continued as they had for years that the U.S. was winning. Americans grew more and more war-weary. A conflict that had began at nearly 100% support was viewed as a mistake by nearly 50% of the country as of 2014. By 2018, 53% of Americans, including 60% of veterans, didn't view the U.S. as having a clear objective in Afghanistan. But the public was told, year after year, that the situation was improving, that the U.S. was going to win the war. Today, the Taliban is considered to be stronger than at any point in 2001. Why? The explanation is simple. Americans were lied to. In 2010, a huge collection of documents was released. Nearly 100,000 reports written by soldiers in the country revealed civilian killings classified as insurgent killings, the growing strength of the Taliban, including their acquisition of surface-to-air missiles, and an overall devastating picture of progress in the war, which by then had stretched on for nearly a decade. Today, the Taliban controls an estimated 19% of districts in Afghanistan. The U.S. pressed on, unfazed by these reports, and 9 years later, another devastating blow came to claims of progress in the war. In 2019, the Washington Post revealed a new cache of documents. These ones prove that the hopelessness of the situation in Afghanistan was known by U.S. officials. Instead of admitting it and drawing down the war, they lied. SIGAR, an independent oversight body tasked with overseeing the reconstruction of Afghanistan, had conducted hundreds of interviews, which were revealed in the release. The current president and then finance minister of Afghanistan admitted in 2002 that nearly all of the money spent by the U.S. on Afghanistan was wasted. The Afghan economy, he said, could absorb a maximum of $2 billion a year. This means that the U.S. had been wasting about $5 billion a year since the beginning of the conflict. An estimated 40% of aid sent to Afghanistan since 2001 has been funneled to corrupt officials, drug runners, and warlords. Revealed as well was manipulation of statistics to make the conflict seem less bleak. The metrics were always manipulated for the duration of the war, one official was quoted as saying. Though they tried to make the situation look better to the public through manipulation and selective use of statistics, it was all to hide a plain fact. The U.S. was not winning the war and had not been for a long time. But there's another problem here, beyond all the wasted money and lies about progress. Supporting the U.S. war in Afghanistan is a shadowy infrastructure that will remain long after the military is gone. Private security contractors far outnumber members of the military. A study published in June 2020 found that government has used the commercialization of the military as camouflage, concealing the true financial and human cost of America's post-9/11 wars. And though billions of dollars in taxpayer money goes into their pockets, these contractors are unaccountable. We aren't even sure how many of them there are. The Center for Constitutional Rights writes that currently there is no effective system of contractor accountability and oversight in place. Though private military contractors were responsible for sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses in Iraq, no prosecutions have taken place. The most famous military contractor used by our government, Blackwater, was responsible for the 2007 Nisour Square massacre of 17 innocent civilians at a traffic circle. Effectively, we have created this infrastructure and it will outlast us. This is yet another disastrous consequence of the decision to go into Afghanistan in the first place. And if the war was winnable, what would it take? Despite an occupation longer than the lives of many soldiers fighting it, sustained by billions of dollars in aid, much of it wasted, the United States is hardly closer today to anything they could call a victory than when they went in. We could stay the course for another 50 or 60 years, but who's to say that we'll have made any more progress by then? By all current indications, we would be at the same place we're in now, if not worse. The decision to withdraw is smart, and it's vital that the Biden administration follow through and end the U.S.'s longest-running war. The Bush administration's folly in bringing us into Afghanistan should not trap us there forever.